Chapter 24, Functional Behavior Assessments. There are two main functions of problem behavior, and it's either positive reinforcement, so obtaining something, and negative reinforcement, which is getting out of something. And of those two, we'll go into more detail later, they can either be socially mediated or non-socially mediated. When we say socially mediated, that means that the learner is depending on another person to deliver that reinforcement. And then non-socially mediated or automatic means the behavior itself is reinforced. So that means automatic reinforcement or direct access to something by exhibiting a behavior. So for positive reinforcement, socially mediated would be like attention from others or needing access to stimuli. And then for automatic, that can be some type of automatic reinforcement or stimulation. Socially mediated negative reinforcement would be escape from an aversive or difficult task. And then automatic or non-socially mediated negative reinforcement can be escape from an aversive stimulation or pain. Function versus topography of behavior. So topography, or the form of the behavior, is what the behavior actually looks like. Function is the function of the behavior. So, behaviors can look the same but have different functions. So different topographies of problem behavior, they can serve the same function or different function. Similar topographies of problem behavior can also serve the same function or a different function. But overall, the function is more important for intervention than form, right? Because once we know why they're exhibiting that behavior, we can identify the replacement behavior, and the replacement behavior has to match the function of the behavior. So a functional behavior assessment allows us to find the function of the behavior, which can then help us identify the appropriate interventions for a problem behavior. Those interventions can look like altering or changing antecedent variables, altering consequent variables, and then teaching the alternative behaviors. When we're altering antecedent variables, we're changing and or eliminating antecedents. So the first thing we can do is looking at the motivating operation for the problem behavior and the discriminative stimuli that trigger that problem behavior. So for example, if you were to change the motivating operation for attention-seeking behavior, we would go back to, I forget what chapter it is, but in abolishing operations and non-contingent reinforcement, right? So we would offer maybe non-contingent reinforcement for attention, and that would serve as an abolishing operation, which would then decrease the need for the learner to exhibit the problem behavior to get attention. When we look at the discriminative stimuli, we would look at how we might change that. And if we're looking at altering the antecedent, that's things like a visual schedule, visual reminders of using functional communication. Altering consequent variables. So that would mean we would place the problem behavior on extinction. And if you remember, extinction is when you withhold the identified reinforcer when the problem behavior occurs. And then we'll also talk about reinforcing the replacement behavior. When teaching alternative behaviors, we are teaching behaviors that serve the same function as the problem behavior. And then we want to provide the same reinforcer that was maintaining that problem behavior contingent on the new behavior. So again, we look at functional communication training, right? So if the function of the behavior is to gain attention, the replacement behavior is to request attention appropriately, right? It meets the same function, but we want to make sure that we provide that reinforcer contingently and more densely than we would the problem behavior. FBAs and default technologies. So the difference between an FBA and the results, right, is that we're, again, teaching replacement behaviors according to function. Where in default technologies, these are things that can be intrusive, oftentimes they're punishment-based, and then they're selected arbitrarily, meaning we're not looking at the function of the behavior. So an example could be like writing standards, right? So I know that was a common punishment intervention where if a student was disruptive, then we would have them write sentences over and over again about not being disruptive. But what that doesn't do is look at the function for why they're being disruptive, and it doesn't teach a new replacement behavior. So understanding why a behavior occurs suggests how it can be changed, and again, understanding FBAs and why these default technologies are not effective. FBAs and prevention of problem behavior. So again, when default technologies are used, other problems can then emerge. So the FBA, again, helps us develop the interventions that could avoid the development of other problem behaviors that could probably have the same function. And then FBAs can also identify conditions, like in the environment, that are posing a risk for the development of future problem behaviors. So here's the continuum of FBA methods, and you can see that at the bottom it starts with the level of difficulty and the level of precision. So at the bottom you'll see indirect assessments, which is like interviews, right? Rating scales, so not so difficult but also less precise. And then you have direct observation in the natural routine. And then at the very top is the analog functional analysis. So this is also another term for your functional analysis assessment. So that's where you're actually manipulating variables to test the hypothesis. So a functional analysis or a functional experimental analysis, again, often referred to as analog, is when antecedents and consequences are arranged so that their separate effects on the problem behavior can be observed and measured. So we'll talk about how you conduct one in just a few slides. But again, it's similar to what's occurring in the natural environment, but when it's set up this way, it's more systematic, and then it allows for better control for your assessment. So there are 4 conditions when you are running a functional analysis. And the first one is contingent attention. The next one is contingent escape. Then there's the alone condition, and then the control condition or the free play condition. And in your text, they go into detail as far as what you do in each condition. But basically in the contingent attention, when they exhibit the behavior, you're going to actually give them attention for the maladaptive behavior. If it's contingent escape, that means you're going to present a task. When they exhibit the behavior, you're going to remove the task. So you're temporarily reinforcing the maladaptive behavior. The alone condition is there's no demands placed, there's no stimuli, and they're just observed. And that would confirm the hypothesis for automatic reinforcement. And then there's the control group or condition, and basically they have access to all of the toys in the room and your attention, and they're all presented one at a time. And when you see the behavior increase, that confirms that that condition is the function of that behavior. So when you're interpreting the results of this functional analysis, you see that there is a high rate of the behavior during the contingent attention condition. So this would tell us that the attention function is, or that attention is a function of this behavior. And so here are the results of a functional analysis. And the results show that because the highest rate of the behavior occurred during the escape condition, that escape is the function of this behavior.
In this graph, you see that in the alone attention, the behavior occurs at the highest rate. This confirms that automatic reinforcement is the function of the behavior. In this graph, we see an undifferentiated pattern. The behavior occurs in no particular pattern across all of the conditions. A functional analysis shows a clear connection between an environmental context and the behavior. It allows for the practitioner to have control of the environment. Strengthening our hypothesis. One limitation of a functional analysis is that it temporarily reinforces the problem behavior, which strengthens the behavior. In addition, the behavior can also start to serve a new function during this process. Because of this, acceptability is low. A functional analysis is difficult to use for serious behaviors, such as aggression or self-injurious behaviors. It's also hard to use for behaviors that do not occur a lot. In controlled settings, we cannot account for variables that occur in the natural environment. Also, this can be time-consuming and sometimes not feasible for practitioners. A descriptive functional behavior assessment is when we directly observe a behavior in the natural environment. The events are not manipulated. The three different forms are ABC Continuous Recording, ABC Narrative Recording, and Scatterplot. ABC Continuous Recording records the antecedents, the behaviors, and consequences of a behavior in the natural routine. Here is an example of an ABC Continuous Recording form. Here you will see that the observer makes check marks in the appropriate boxes. Advantages of ABC recording is that it uses precise measures and provides important information regarding the environment and context of a problem behavior. It also does not interrupt one's routine or environment. Some limitations of ABC continuous recording include antecedents and consequences not always happening right before or right after a problem behavior. ABC narrative recording is when the observer writes down behaviors as they occur. It is open-ended and is less time-consuming because it only covers problem behaviors as they occur. Here is a sample narrative recording form. Here you see the open spaces for notes, versus the checkboxes as seen in the continuous recording form. Some limitations with ABC narrative recording include not identifying the functions established. Also, only tracking when problem behaviors occur does not identify the same antecedents when the problem behavior is absent. Reliability may be low when using ABC narrative recording because the observer may infer or assume. A scatterplot helps to identify if a behavior occurs more during a certain part of the day. Divide the day into segments of time. Then track when the behaviors occurs in the corresponding time slot. Here is a sample of a scatterplot collection form. You will see that they have a code to indicate how many times a behavior occurred during each time block. Scatterplots help to identify when a behavior occurs the most. This can then help identify when ABC data may need to be conducted. One limitation is that scatterplots may be subjective in nature. Indirect assessments involve collecting information without directly observing the behaviors. These include structured interviews, checklists, and rating scales. The goal of structured behavioral interviews is to get a clear picture and objective information about the problem behaviors. This includes antecedents and consequences. You can interview significant others or the student themselves. Behavior rating scales ask informants to estimate the extent to which a behavior occurs under certain contexts. The scores help to formulate a hypothesis. Indirect assessments are useful information for guiding the assessments. They contribute to developing a hypothesis as to why a problem behavior occurs. They are also convenient and do not require observations. Limitations include inaccuracy and bias of those being interviewed. It is not recommended to be the only method when conducting an assessment and when identifying functions of problem behaviors. In summary, conducting an FBA includes gathering information using indirect methods and observation. This helps to develop a hypothesis. The hypothesis is then tested using a functional analysis. Then interventions are recommended. We can gather information by conducting interviews with the individual's care providers. This information helps us to define the problem behaviors, and to identify potential antecedents and consequences. We can also gather information by directly observing the problem behavior in the natural environment. Interpreting information and formulating a hypothesis. It helps to write the hypothesis in ABC format. See the example below. Based on this information, we can hypothesize the function is escape from hand washing or lunch. Test the hypothesis by conducting a functional analysis. Remember to include a control condition. Other conditions should be selected based on the hypothesis. Alternate conditions when a pattern has emerged. You can conduct a brief functional analysis in a shorter period of time by implementing one session of the control condition, one session of each test condition, and a contingency reversal. A contingency reversal confirms a hypothesis when you provide reinforcement for the alternative behavior. For example, functional communication. The problem behavior is no longer reinforced. Here is an example of a functional analysis with a contingency reversal. Here you see that the alternative behavior is functional communication. When functional communication is reinforced, the problem behavior decreases. The functional behavior assessment does not identify interventions. It does identify functions of behaviors to help identify replacement behaviors. It also identifies reinforcers that can help to teach replacement behaviors. Interventions and replacement behaviors must have functional equivalence to the problem behaviors. In other words, we must make sure that the interventions address the functions that maintain the problem behavior. If a problem behavior served a function to gain access, the replacement behavior should meet the same function. We can also alter antecedents to make the problem behaviors less reinforcing. We can alter the ABC contingency. For example, when the learner is left alone, then hits someone, which is followed by a reprimand, we can change the antecedent and consequence to change that behavior. Here, we change the antecedent by providing a peer buddy during work or play periods. This makes the hitting irrelevant because he has attention. Here, we alter the behavior. When he is left alone, he is then prompted to ask a peer or adult for attention. As a result, he gets attention in the form of socialization or help. In this example, we alter the consequence for the problem behavior. When he hits, he no longer receives attention for that behavior. In summary, prior to intervention, it's important to identify the function. When creating an intervention plan, change and modify the ABC contingency. It's important to remember that interventions should continue to be assessed by monitoring their effectiveness and making changes over time as needed, or as the functions change.